Hey everyone, it's Micah with Service Reef, and today we had the opportunity to sit down with Jay Schroder, who is the Director of Partner Development at Southeast Christian Church in Louisville, Kentucky. And we got to talk around a lot of different elements around mobilization, specifically within local versus global. And how do you measure that engagement? How do you develop partnerships? How do you develop some of these um, methodologies to try to make sure that you're spending time and energy where God has called you to? And so it was really a fun conversation to have with Jay, and I know you'll enjoy it as well. Jay, tell me just a little bit about yourself. What is it that you do? How did you kind of get into this space?
Yeah, through a variety of different steps. What I do now is not what I started doing at Southeast, much less what I started at in ministry or in missions. I've pastored a small church. I've been a part of a few church plants. Ended up at Southeast 7 years ago, working specifically on some local outreach initiatives that we had, sending people in some ways cross culturally, but just in our own city, and then have shifted this as things changed into this role. So I now lead the portion of our team that focuses on serving and caring for and helping train, but also give to the different partner organizations and missionaries that Southeast is blessed to be a part of locally, nationally, and around the world.
That's awesome. We Tell me about like either your first global adventure or like I know you deal with a lot with local, you know, partnerships and different local serving. Any stories come to mind for you of like,
Yeah, no,
hey,
when you say first global in high school, uh, certainly global adventure. Mission trip might be a little debatable, but in high school, I went to Kenya with a group from my high school. The group of us were all Christians, and we went to serve for a week at a Christian school in Nyeri, Kenya, which is not very far outside Nairobi, but is like a 6 hour drive. And it was the first real cross cultural experience that I had had like that. And to be surrounded by a week, both with the joy and the dedication to prayer and the depth of spiritual connection that other high school students at this school had was challenging and inspiring. And then also to see that really laid next to the lack of material things that they had and the lack of opportunity. I mean, we were seniors in high school. This was our spring break in March. Most of us already had either college plans figured out or an idea of options of what we were going to do after this. And, that wasn't even on the radar for most of these elementary and middle school age kids. It wasn't a possibility. It wasn't something they would really be thinking about. So it was jarring, to say the least, to see their lack of options juxtaposed with their deep, deep faith.
yeah, it sounds like it was something that was definitely memorable for
Yeah,
and stuck with you, right?
for
As many
sure.
of us. Jay, tell me a little bit about your current role and passion within this missions and mobilization space. It's been a journey for a couple years now, so just give me a little idea of where you're currently at and what you're excited about.
Yeah, certainly a key piece of my passion is to see more and more of our people not just be in the habit of coming to church and attending a worship service, whether that's once a week or once a month, apparently, according to Varna, for most of them, but to actually get out and get engaged in the mission. To see them, I would love to see here, and I'm sure this is the same with most churches. I would love to see our culture of as a church shift to where it's just assumed as normal that if you're a part of Southeast, you're engaged in the mission. That might be in your neighborhood, that might be with immigrants and refugees in our community, it might be across the world. But to have that kind of temperature of like, I think it's well known, I think people feel when they come here like, well, gosh, if I'm going to stick around, I'm expected to go to that starting point class. I want people to feel that same weight for getting engaged in the mission. We use the term unleashed for that as the first term of our vision statement as a church, unleashing the full force of the church to love people one at a time. And so I want people to feel the weight that like part of what it means to be a part of Southeast is to be unleashed.
I love that vision.
Yeah.
Yeah, I was going to say it's hard to get there. What do you feel or what have you experienced as maybe the most difficult part of being like that mobilization leader within your
Mm.
church?
Yeah. So my role is more specifically preparing the side of the equation where the people land. Maybe it's serving weekly relationally with an after-school program in our own community. Maybe it's the partners we send short-term trips to, or the places people go as long-term missionaries or as interns in between. I work a lot with those missionaries and partners on that. I think the most difficult part of the equation as a whole is certainly changing our internal culture and seeing more movement there. The most difficult part with my piece in particular, I mean, honestly, a lot of it's fantastic. But we do, like any relationship, there come times where you have to have hard conversations. Sometimes they come from the other side of the relationship, something we messed up or something we overpromised on or something we didn't communicate clearly and was misunderstood. Sometimes they come from our side. We discover something we're concerned about, and I have to figure out a phone call, a meeting, a video call like this, and say, hey, tell me more, but we have this concern. And walking with some partners through those concerns, or as they walk through crises, is also, obviously it's challenging when they face difference. Some of them are of their own doing, some of them are circumstances entirely out of their control. Sometimes it's something we think is a crisis that they think is perfectly fine. Sometimes it's something they think is a crisis, but we're able to say, no, actually, we've seen a lot of organizations where people go through this. We'll help you out, but I think you're going to be fine. I don't think this is a crisis, but people walk through tough stuff, and walking with them in that can be challenging for sure, but it's good. It's good work.
Yeah. Do you feel like there's a misconception, or maybe a different way of asking it, what is the biggest misconception people have about either partner selection or partner development?
Yeah, those are probably two different answers. I think selection for the people who are applying, the biggest misconception is they're automatically going to say yes because I have some connection to Southeast. And that's a hard expectation to live up to, because we can't do that. We get way too many. I mean, this last cycle, we got 14 actual applications, and I probably get on a weekly basis 2 or 3 others that didn't actually apply, sending me what they think is a compelling ask for our resources or our time or our efforts. So the anticipation that we're going to be able to respond to everything with a yes and jump in with both feet, rather than the reality that we have to prayerfully determine a strategy and move forward based on that strategy. That's challenging. On the development side, so for us, we partner together. We have a lengthy application and get to know you and investigate, and globally that includes a site visit. We actually want to see what's going on the ground. So once we get through all that and we're partnering together, then when we start talking about development, there are probably a few different pain points, right? So one of the pain points is at the beginning, sometimes the organization doesn't know, for either good or bad. They don't know what to ask for. They don't know that if this goes in a healthy way, we could actually send them 2 or 3 short-term trips a year. They think, gosh, if I can get 4 people to come over here for a weekend, that's the best time. So maybe they're asking for something we could actually do more to help than they're asking for, and it's because they don't know. But of course, then it goes on the flip side too. Some people see the size of our church and they think we're better at mobilizing people than we are, and so they think we're going to send them a short-term trip every month, or a certain amount of funds or whatever it is. So at the beginning, a lot of that is just getting to know each other and helping land in a lane with expectations that makes sense. And then I think we've been blessed to walk with a lot of the organizations we walk with for a very long time. So I think down the road, as you kind of figure that out, then what runs into it is unexpected crises, financial crisis, something like COVID, loss of a staff, loss of several board members at the same time, some sort of internal conflict. Sometimes it's our people go volunteer on a short-term trip and come back with a bone to pick or something they think is wrong with the organization, and so it creates a crisis that's not actually a crisis. So there's a variety of ways that can go, but that's, I think, it's relationship. So you just got to weather that all out, just like you do with any other friend.
I think that's good. I think that's good, Jay. For some that are listening, they're in this process of trying to maybe select partners or kind of walk through that to a place where they do feel good. You talked a little bit about your training and kind of your onboarding, your application. Can you just share maybe at a 10,000-foot level, kind of the process an organization would go through to be a partner with you guys?
Sure. So we have actually just recently gone to a once-a-year online application. It used to be people would mail a paper packet in and they would send it in whenever they wanted to. And we found that did not help us make good decisions, because we were constantly evaluating. And so it wasn't always top of the mind. And we might say yes to something, and then 3 months later, something more compelling, but in the same strategic space comes along, then we've already got our hands tied. So we've gone to once a year. That's been really helpful. Um, we've gone to an application. It's online, but it asks obviously every partner the same questions. That's really helpful. We have found we want it to remain relational, but when it's only people talking to people and them coming back and reporting information, depending on that person, depends on what information we get. So sometimes you get a lot of the business side, sometimes you get a lot of the great kingdom story impact side, but we want both of those things and some other things, so we put it online. So for an organization, they would apply online between October and December. We would spend January to March reviewing those, vetting them, and responding. Locally, in that time is usually sufficient to give a yes or no by the end of March. Internationally, a yes or no, by the end of March, what comes is we'd like to take the next step. The next step is to come see you. When can we schedule that to happen? And there's not a firm yes until we've actually been able to have a visit. So it takes a little longer internationally, but that's our process. The other piece of that I think that's really helpful is that we very clearly have defined what we think is healthy in missions. Our distinctives is what we call them. I mean, there are some obvious things like financial transparency, like good communication among leaders, but there's some less obvious things they're more and more common in the mission space now. But we want to work with organizations that are led by people who are from the cultures that are trying to be impacted, not led by Americans who think from over here they can discern the best thing to do over there somewhere else, or even across the city. To be honest, we see this locally too. And that rules out a lot of things. So it helps to be clear before you get applications. It helps to be clear with what you think is healthy and strategic and that you want to pursue, so you can measure those applications against something. Otherwise, it just comes down to who has the best relationship with the most influential people. And then you're just saying yes to the people who shout the loudest rather than yes to what the direction that God has actually called you as a church to do.
Yeah, go up a level for a second, because I think a lot of this is predicated on your overall vision and your strategy for where you feel God has called you guys to be at. How did you get to that point, either as a staff, or how has that shifted over the last 6 or 7 years for you guys, and making sure that that's clear even before the application process starts?
Right. And we do allow people to apply whether they fit our strategy or not, but it's very easy then to say this just doesn't fit our strategy. I would say what's really helped, an example of what's really helped in the last few years, we have regularly had international partners in a variety of global places, and we're going to continue to do that. But we have noticed both a increased need to mobilize our own people and a strategic window in Eastern Europe, former communist countries, where Americans are welcomed. And people, when Americans go over there on a short-term trip or an internship or whatever it is, people are excited to see someone who speaks English. They want to have a conversation with you. That's not the same in other parts of the world where Americans go as tourists and people are just tired of Americans. So we have noticed both an increased need on our end to mobilize more people and a place in the world where we can actually be strategically effective. And we have several partners there who have exhibited an extremely strategic use of our short-term teams. 2 of the 3 actually also have Southeast members as Americans on staff as missionaries. They're not running the show, they're just playing a role. Both sides of that we think is really important. So we've decided to kind of focus in and double down on some of that. So that's just one. There are a couple of things internationally that the Eastern Europe focus. Another thing, we want to continue to figure out how to turn more of our financial resources to the extremely unreached, possibly even unengaged areas of the world where it's hard for us to send our people, because most of those places that are left are places where Americans are not going to be strategic. They're going to be followed around and they're going to get the locals in trouble, and all those things. So we kind of, we recognize that there's some places where we can't effectively send our people. We also recognize that if you looked probably 8 or 10 years ago at our financial commitments, they were not as spread evenly to understand the complexity and the difficulty of doing ministry in those places. So we are open most to places we can support financially some local leaders who are doing great work in an extremely hard to reach places, and then places where we can send our people alongside those works.
That's awesome. And I would say a lot of that, from what I've seen as well, Jay, is that it's changed a lot in the last 3 or 4 years. And having those locals rise up is
Sure.
just a cool opportunity for God to work in areas that Western could not get into before. Right. So,
Right.
that's awesome. That's awesome. Contrast that a little bit locally for a second. Like what's some of the differences or challenges maybe that you've had in engaging or developing local partners versus kind of the global side of those?
Yeah, so that's a good question. The application process, all that, the philosophy is actually the same. It plays out two layers down a little differently. So, like locally, you have to be a 501c3. You have to be an officially registered nonprofit. Globally, in some countries, that designation doesn't make any sense. Locally, we won't invest in an organization's property that they don't actually own. Like we don't want to invest in your personal house, and we don't want to invest in a property that the title's not clear. Where titling property in other places in the world doesn't play by the same rules. So we ask the same question, but we're way more comfortable if there's a different answer, depending on why and what the rationale in that particular country and its background is. And sometimes we'll invest in those things. Locally, I think also we work with, so the same two things are important as far as mobilizing our people and then doing what we can. We have a significant amount of immigrants. Louisville is above average in its welcoming to immigrants and refugees. So we have significantly more opportunity to reach people from unreached, unengaged places here locally than a city you would think of Louisville's size might have. So we do invest in those things. It looks different. The size of the organizations are a lot smaller. Our average local partner might be, 3, 4, 5 people on staff, somewhere around $500,000, $750,000 operation annually. Our maybe not average. We have some small mom and pop like that internationally, but it's also common internationally for us. I mean, we work with a few organizations that have a couple hundred, a few hundred people on staff, millions in their annual budget. So it's smaller and more refined, and we're much more likely locally to have each of our campuses have 3 to 5 local partners that they're building a deep affinity and relationship with. Typically, those are the ones right in their backyard. Whereas really most of our campuses might only have 1, maybe 2 if they're really mature in their missions as a campus that's not local. So it's a broader, more of them, but smaller organizations.
How do you work in helping that connection, in essence, between, all right, we have a population that wants to go serve, and maybe it's more campus driven, like, hey, in this area, not all of our listeners will have multiple campuses. So I want to be cautious of that, Jay, if that makes sense. But
Right.
like there may be some local partnerships you have a better relationship to, or they came out of that church in order to raise, and they felt God calling them to meet that need. How do you start to kind of connect the dots a little bit for the folks to get them to that space?
Yeah, well, let me hit new ones first and then talk about established. So with new local partners, just like you would in a job interview for someone you're interviewing, you would not ask what they want to do when they start working for you. You would ask, well, are you like, tell me how you manage your time now. Tell me how detail oriented you are now if you're looking for a detail person. We ask applicants locally now, like how many Southeast people are you connected to that volunteer with you already? Because if you don't have any now, we're a big church. There are a lot of people here in town. If you don't have any of our people now, that's not going to change just because we make you a partner as much as you might think it would change. For ones that are established, we work within the campus and within the people there. But I think that's the same, honestly, even a church that doesn't have a campus, um, or doesn't have multiple campuses, it's where's the audience, right? Maybe the audience of people is in women's ministry, men's ministry, student ministry. So we try to go to those leaders and say, hey, who would you like? Do the leadership of the men's group happen to have a real interest in one of these immigrant groups in our city, or in and so for right now, some of the groups, the women's group here has chosen to really connect with a ministry that helps immigrants, mostly Indian, Hindu, Buddhist immigrants. They learn how to sew stuff and make purses and make jewelry, and so they're learning some job skills and they're making an income from that. And it's mostly women that are doing that, so it's been a really natural connection that has helped the women's ministry promote something they're proud of and talk about it a lot and bring the leaders in and pray for them and encourage them, and it's helped ladies to get involved. So we try to let them at that, whatever missions doesn't have an audience, and it's not the same at every church, but at most churches you have your subset of like missions junkies who lead your trips and show up whenever a missionary is in town. And then you got the other 95% of the congregation that you really wish would get engaged. So we've been trying to go where that 95% is, because they're volunteering in women's ministry and in men's ministry and in student ministry, and they greet and whatever it is. And so if I can build an affinity there where all the greeters in the annual greeter training or whatever they do are also hearing about a mission partner, because that group has gotten together with even an overseas partner and said, we're going to support this person. And they're building that kind of relationship and affinity. So that's how we try to bridge that both locally and globally.
I think that's a great transition too to Jay. One of the questions I want to ask, are there ways that you've tracked engagement in the past that didn't work, or did some work better than others? Why, or what kind of metrics have you found to be helpful in that? Because
Yeah,
that's a hard piece, right?
it is a really hard piece. And to be honest, we have really struggled with this. And for most of the missions history at Southeast, we haven't tracked much. We could probably go tell you how many people attended Perspectives, which is a class in kind of worldview that we offer quite regularly, usually at least yearly, if not 2 or 3 times a year at different campuses. And we could probably tell you how many people went on short-term trips. We can certainly tell you how many people we're supporting on the field as members. And that's good. Nothing's wrong with those measurements. But that leaves out a huge portion of our congregation that we have no idea if they're growing in their missions engagement or not. So it's not so much that those numbers didn't work as it is that those things aren't sufficient by themselves. So we have started the beginning process of laying a foundation. Like I said, we're using Unleashed as a term. We're going to have a workshop that we ask everyone to go through, and a workbook that accompanies that, and a pathway that's known that we can start. And so people will have the opportunity to put their information, maybe it's their passion, maybe it's their skill set, some job experience stuff that will help match them with local serving opportunities, but they'll do that through a software, an app. That I'm obviously your audience probably has figured out this is why we're talking. The app is actually, the software behind it is written and run and produced by Service Reef, which we're really thankful for. So that allows us, we haven't turned on that piece yet, but when that profile gets in there, that allows us to start seeing how many of our people have filled that out, how many people have used that information to connect with something that they're committed to and passionate about. And then it'll even start taking attendance as they serve with our partners, if we can encourage our partners to set up the serving opportunities correctly. So we will be able to do some more tracking in that engagement. But it's the other piece on that, and if someone else out there listening has a great way to measure this, I'd love to know. I feel like we are mostly constrained to tracking markers like attendance and what do people do with their time, which is not the same as tracking the transformation that's happening in their hearts. Now, there's some places we see that transformation, right? I mean, like, for instance, as a church, obviously we count the number of people we baptize. Not only is that a number that tracks how many people we actually baptize, but there's obviously some transformation going in someone's decision to be baptized. So, when someone decides they're going to go overseas, they're becoming a missionary, and we're going to start supporting them. Obviously, that speaks to some transformation. But for most of our tracking, it's how many people are regularly and relationally serving in the community, and we'll get that numerical information back from our partners and eventually from Unleashed itself, from an app itself. But it isn't always the same as transformation. It's a good step. It's a good thing to measure, but that doesn't tell us how many of those people that they're serving is actually changing them, which is something I'd like to know.
Yeah, I would say that is definitely a challenge, Jay, for other pastors that I've talked to as well, and ministry leaders, is how do you measure the heart? And that's
Right.
hard, right? And I mean, yes, you can look at small group engagement or life group engagement. You can look at, serving on a Sunday or serving in those things, but some people are just service oriented. That doesn't necessarily mean they're driving deeper, right? And so one of the challenges, I think, if I were to try to summarize this quickly, it would be those changes require relationship in order to know, right? Am I a
Right.
better person or a better husband or a better father because of my life with Christ? You have to know me to know who I was before, and then see me in a regular basis to have that. And that requires relationship, and relationship is messy, and it's not super metrics driven. So
Right.
it's a
Absolutely.
challenge.
Yeah.
But well, okay, so kind of in that, like, is there information that you found successful when you're trying to cast this vision out a little bit, Jay, to even your own internal leadership, your own like, hey, this
Yeah.
is where we're getting excited. Here's where we're going. What are some ways that you found to kind of cast that vision, share the information? Maybe it is, hey, we can get a little bit more metrics as well, but also like how's that worked for you in the past, and what have you found successful?
Yeah, it's usually both sharing a story and pairing a metric with it that speaks to the scale, right? So I might share the story of someone who graduated from Perspectives, and because they took Perspectives, now they're engaged reaching immigrants and refugees. In fact, the leader of that ministry I was talking about that our women's ministry is connected to stepped into that because of Perspectives. Awesome. So I might share that story, but hearing that story, you don't know, okay, we poured all this time and effort into Perspectives. I don't know how many people we had in the class, but one success story, so I might pair both of those, right? Here's some information Here's the success story. Just so you know, we've had this many graduates at Perspectives, and this many are really making some life-changing decisions because of that. So similarly for missionaries, I might share a story of here's one of our missionaries on the field and how they've changed, how they've seen some impact this year. But just so you know, leadership, they're actually 110, 112, 108, something like that, people we support on the field that are like this. So I think it's both a story, a number by itself can be hard to communicate the actual depth of the impact and isn't as inspiring in some ways, especially when you don't have context to know if that's a really big number or a small number or what. But a story by itself doesn't tell you the scale. So I think trying to pair the story with the number is helpful.
I appreciate that. I appreciate that. Jay, what is the biggest challenge you're facing in your role or projects that are coming up right now? And how are you tackling it?
Yeah, to be honest, the biggest challenge I'm facing is figuring out which pieces of this challenge to go after first. Which I think is probably a pretty common problem in anyone's work. But as our team we've had a significant amount of transition over the last 2 or 3 years. A lot of people's roles are different, and we have a lot of great ideas of things we want to do. We simply cannot do them all this month, or this year, even probably. So trying to prayerfully and with the wisdom and counsel of others, step back and put all the options out there, and then say, all right, God help us prioritize. Y'all help me prioritize. Which of these comes before the others, and then as we embrace the things we're working on, keeping things that are interrelated with each other moving at the same pace. So that's not a particularly missionsy answer, but it's definitely the reality of what's the most challenging right now.
Yeah, for sure. For sure. Casting out a little bit, and I know there's both a local piece of this and a global side of this, but um, what do you think mobilization starts to look like in the next 3 to 5 years?
Yeah, I think for us, certainly we're hopeful as we continue to put more of an emphasis and create a pathway for this, that it starts to be much broader than it has been in the past. Excuse me. I think in the past, those that have succeeded dramatically have been the entrepreneurial types who they were willing to beat their own path through the forest to find the mountaintop that they wanted to get to, and they founded an organization or taken their family and lived overseas as a career or whatever, and that's awesome. That's fantastic. But most people aren't wired that way. Most people actually want to go with someone who's going to show them the way and have a sense of what the next step is. So I think with Unleashed, as we build a pathway that people can follow and can know what the next step is, I hope for us the next 3 to 5 years looks like we're starting to get not just the entrepreneurs and the earliest of early adapters, but we're starting to get regular people who say, yeah, if you help me with this, I can go do that. And we haven't really made a way for that to happen before. One of the things we're leaning into in that is business professionals. Previously, our systems had more been set up only for missionaries who are raising their own support. That's what gets you on our missionary list. And then we do all sorts of other things to care for you and encourage you. It turns out there's some places in the world where that's really awkward to go, because then no one who's there knows why you're there, and they think you're either a trafficker or maybe you're with the CIA, but either way, they don't want to have a conversation. So we are much more interested, and maybe a little late to this game, but much more interested in casting a vision for what does it look like for our members to take their job and to go and work, especially in some of these restricted access, creative access, whatever you want to call them, countries. They get paid, they don't have to raise support, but they still need cross-cultural training. They still need to learn some of the language in some way without taking 2 years off of work. They still need care. They're still going to hit hurdles that they don't expect, and they're going to need encouragements in how to stay there in community that supports them in that. And so building those systems in order to see that kind of an impact is definitely on our radar. And I think as a larger and larger every year conversation in the missions world in general is how do we switch that? Not that we won't support, I guess I would now call a traditional missionary. We do want to keep that open. There are some avenues that works really well for, and some places people are really able to make an impact with that. But how do we add to that another lane for people who have absolutely are freaked out and would not ever ask their friends and family for money, but love their job? Their job is in demand in a place in the Arabian Peninsula or some of these places we haven't been able to get to for other reasons. They can get paid, sometimes even more, and they're willing to go. They have an affinity for living cross-culturally and want to try the experiment. They just don't have any need to raise money and don't want to go to language school. And so how do we mobilize and equip and release them in some ways, unleash them into that vision and into that mission. Our friends there's a Bible translation agency we work with a lot, and they'd say, hey, all the easy ones are gone. Like all the places you could move easily and translate the Bible, those are all taken. The ones that are left are the ones that are going to require a coalition of people, some of whom are going to start a business that gives legit cover, and it has to be a legit business that's actually making money and has a mission and is contributing to the community, or that you all look like idiots. And if you look like idiots, you don't have any influence. If you don't have any influence, you cannot learn the language and translate. So I think we're going to see more and more of that. I hope we will in our church, and I think the church at large will see more and more of that in mobilization too.
Yeah, it is interesting how there's certain things within technology and world, and like you can fly anywhere around the world now, and yet that makes other things harder, right? And so it's adapting to the world that you're in this moment, and the world where it will be in 3 to 5 years, and trying to like get into that space. You actually reminded me of a book, Jay. It was called Crossing the Chasm. It was written back probably now 20 years ago, but it was talking about the early adopters, right? Those, you talk about that entrepreneurial, like,
right.
I'll just go. Like, that's great. I buy the vision. Let's go. And now it's like, but as you're looking at Unleashed and trying to draw in the overall, the other 95% of folks that are sitting in the church, how do you get them out into there? So it's really fun. Some creative things being done in that space too, to say, hey guys, God is not giving you secular gifts and spiritual gifts. He's giving you gifts, right? And so use them for the kingdom in a way, whether it's business leaders, people who have business want to create that in a different culture. Some people are just gifted in that way, or you've been gifted in accountancy or whatever. Great. There's tons that could use that help, right? Both locally for 501c3s that you work with, and then also
absolutely,
like, hey, globally. So no, I think that's cool. That's cool. Hopefully as the rest of the body starts to catch on, it's like, hey, this isn't just this thing for the, edge fringe of society or our church. It's for everybody.
Yeah, this isn't for those super mature missionaries that I'll never be. And it's actually a calling that all of us can participate in.
Absolutely. Absolutely. So, okay. So I have to ask the peremptory, Service Reef, like, can you share a story about Service Reef? Like either share a story of how it's helped you or your team in the past. What has your journey or experience been like, Jay?
Yeah. So our team has used Service Reef for short-term trips from the beginning of Service Reef. That's not the role of the team I play. So my first real encounter with Service Reef was when we started to inquire about what it would look like to have this local serving, in essence, at one place, instead of our people having to know all of our different partners locally and how they might serve on those partners. And instead of us having to call those partners, find out what those serving opportunities are, post them on our website, and then find out that they changed their minds and that wasn't Tuesday anymore. Now it was Thursdays, or they got a cook. They don't need a cook. Now they need a Bible study leader or whatever it is. That's impossible to manage. So that's where I first got involved in the conversation with Service Reef. And I referenced it earlier, we have an Unleashed app, and our partners all have accounts. And I think actually like 59 of our 60 local partners now have accounts through Service Reef, and they post their own volunteer opportunities. But because they're part of our partnership through Unleashed, our people can go in the Unleashed app and they can search by their skill set. They can search by their passion. They can search by what their campus is involved in. They can search by what's close to them, and they can find some way that they want to serve. And they're with organizations that we know, we trust, and we have vetted, and we think they'll have a great experience with. So that has really helped us. It is hard for us, and some of this is just size. We have 60 local partners. Even if we wanted to put one up on the stage every week, we wouldn't get through them in a year. So it's much easier for us to share a story of someone in the church with an organization that's serving and making a huge impact, and then say, and you may not be a lawyer, you may not be an accountant, you may not like kids, whatever it is, but there are literally hundreds of other opportunities like this. Download the app, go find the one that fits for you, and point them all to that same place. And it's not a place, I mean, there's a little work on our end to manage it, but primarily this is a space our partners curate and manage, because they want, they all want volunteers. Every nonprofit runs on volunteers. If it's not, it should be. And so they're desperately looking for people to connect to. So it's worth their while. And we specifically wanted to use an outside tool for this rather than our inside database, because we wanted it to be a gift to our partners that they could use to manage their volunteers across the board. Now, some of them already have platforms for that. That's great. That's fine. They can work together. Others of them, they didn't have a volunteer management tool, and Service Reef really can do all that. The background checks, the $10 fee for your new t-shirt, whatever it is, that's, keep people in the process, help figure out a pipeline training for people who are serving regularly. How do they grow to that next step of leadership as a volunteer for you? So we really felt like this was an opportunity not just to facilitate some mobilization internally, but to gift a resource to our partners that might help them with other volunteer recruitment opportunities and other audiences in their own website and other churches, that we don't have to police or be a part of it all. So that's been my experience. That's how I found out about it. We've helped pioneer some of those tools. We're constantly finding things that we didn't think to design in the first iteration. Like, oh, we need to add that. Oh, we should try that. So, it's growing, which is really neat, and it's getting there, which is great.
That's awesome. How are you getting excited about kind of that marrying of like, it's been a journey for Unleashed, right? It's been a journey for local partnerships. But then now with kind of the life plans and kind of walking people through using their own gifts in that space, what are some things as you're casting your mind out 9, 12 months down the road of like, oh my goodness, when we get to this point, like, do you see like an inflection point kind of coming, or how do you see it just yourself?
Yeah, I hope so. And I think for us, it'll be a little bit campus by campus, but as people go through the life plan and the workbook, they will fill out in the app a profile that actually has their skill and passions, and it will automatically start to feed them with opportunities that match what they're interested in and what they're good at, rather than them having to go search for those things one at a time every time they want to try something new. So I think these things will come together and build some momentum. And I think the missing piece right now is more of us building it into the water at Southeast than it is our partners making their opportunities available. And so, at some point that does have a certain momentum, like a flywheel, that comes with it. So we're hopeful, starting into the fall, that we get the opportunity to roll this out. We have 3 pilot campuses that have signed up. So we're hoping we get to kind of roll it out for them as a big launch campus at large, and then it just becomes a normal part of their process. Maybe you go to a starting point class, you go to membership, and then you go to an Unleashed class, and it just becomes normative in the life of the congregation to be able to figure out how they're supposed to be engaged in the community. And our short-term trips are on there too. So in the community around the world, as short-term, and then, you move from that to long-term. So hopefully it becomes part of a healthy process and starts to kind of, I think it feels more like that flywheel analogy of, it's harder to push until it gets going. So these turns around are really hard. But the hope is in the future, as these turns grow and we're all pushing the same direction together, it starts to move faster and faster. And at some point, it's a lot easier to push.
Well, and I'd say that you've already experienced that within the local side, Jay, of like just building the demand, right? Whenever you're doing a dual sided model,
Yeah.
you're like, I have to have enough opportunities for the people to come serve, and I need enough
True.
people that want to go find the opportunities. And so you find that you're like, I invest in one side, then I invest in the other side. I invest in one side, I invest in the other side. And then eventually it does kind of catch on, right?
Yeah. Yeah, that's great.
Well, as we wrap up today, is there any piece of advice you can share with others that are maybe coming into this partner development space or into this mobilization space, Jay? Anything you feel that might be beneficial to those that are listening?
Yeah, I mean, the more we've dug in the last year into partner development, specifically into the kind of capacity development where we might ask organizations to go measure their health in a variety of categories. How are they using their facilities? What is their marketing like? What are their HR processes? How do they onboard new staff? Do they have a process for that? The more we've dug into that, the more that I've discovered more other people who are also digging into that. So I would say, especially, a church that doesn't have the resources to dig into all that on its own, which we don't right now. We have a lot of great ideas of things we want to do. We don't have the time to dig in and do it. It's really worth your while finding out who else is already, even from a faith-based perspective, there are organizations that are doing it really well. And that is a service you can offer your partners, because they're offering it for free to faith-based organizations that you don't have. It doesn't cost you more. It's just things you can make yourself aware of that can be a huge benefit to the missionaries and organizations you have in the US and on the field internationally as well. So, I guess what I would say is don't feel the need to recreate a wheel that's just, a slightly bit different tire than the wheel that's already out there.
So one last question for you. Any other like book recommendations, podcasts, follows, like any recommendations that you're like, hey, I've really enjoyed this over the last year or two, whatever?
Yeah, I mean, there could be so many. A few books. I'm much more of a reader than a podcast listener. I even still read paper books. I know that's strange. I don't listen to them. I like to underline and highlight and then give them to somebody else, I guess, because I don't have room for them all. But there are a few books that have been really good for us as a team.
over the last year. So let's see, I might throw out three of them. One is Engine of Impact. So the name of the book is Engine of Impact. It is a joint Harvard-Stanford study on nonprofits and their health and what causes them to be healthy. It pulls out 7 characteristics. It has the board as one of those. I would argue that 5 of the 7 things in that book really come down to the board, but that's my perspective. But I love the fact that it's actually a research-based study rather than just my intuition or your experience on who's healthy or how do you know if someone could be healthy or what they should grow in. This is research-based. It's not a faith-based book, but it's really good. So Engine of Impact would be one. We've also recently, as a team, read When Missions is Everything, which is basically a book that tells you that missions is not actually everything. But it's really helpful, especially if you're at a church where they start talking a lot about, knocking on your neighbor's door and sharing the gospel as your role in missions. Like everybody should absolutely get to know their neighbor and share the gospel with them if they don't already know it. That's not the same thing as missions. So that might be a good book for some folks to read and be able to hand around, just hypothetically speaking, to some of the leaders in the church who might think everything is missions, because it's not. They'll read it because they'll go, yeah, everything is missions. And then, so I'd recommend that one. And then the third one I'm reading right now, I've really enjoyed. I'm only halfway through, but a book called Learning. Let me make sure I got it right. Hang on. Yep. Leading, not learning, Leading Across Cultures. It's by James Fludeman. And he is with SIM and has been for a while. And it is one of the first ones. I have read a lot about cross-cultural leadership that's about mostly about Americans learning to understand other cultures. And that's great. This is the first one I've read, or at least the first one I remember, that is like his base level of coming to the book is, hey, we've got 6 or 8 cultures represented on this cross-national team in whatever other country that is. So everybody's got a minority perspective. Nobody's culture is in the majority, at least on the team. And we got to figure out how to work together. And some of us have similarities in culture in some ways, and some of us don't. I have found it really, really fascinating. So especially if you're thinking about developing partner organizations that are led by people from other cultures, I would highly recommend that one.
I think that's great. And I would say that leading across culture, I would say just as soon as you form a team, you already have probably multiple cultures represented, even if they seem to look or act or seem the same. But yeah, definitely. That's awesome. I will definitely include those links in there. I'll go find them. Jay, thank you so much for your time. This is Jay Schroder. He is the director of partner engagement at Southeast Christian in Louisville. Anything else, Jay, for your time here, or anything else kind of bubble up to mind?
No, man, thanks for having me. It's been fun to chat about all this stuff. So I hope this helps some people.
Absolutely. Well, blessings on your journey. Thank you so much for your time today, Jay.
Thank you.
Hey, everyone. That was Jay Schroder, Director of Partner Development at Southeast Christian Church in Louisville, Kentucky. And thank you so much, Jay, for your time today and for taking that opportunity for us and the resources that you were able to share. That was a great conversation. We really appreciate it.